let us graph this function and see how it looks like. So we just have to evaluate the function at these two values. When x is equal to 1, then y is equal to 9 minus 1 to the 2/3 to the power 3/2. 1 to any power is 1, so that's going to be 8 to the 3/2. Using your calculator, this should be about 22.6. When x is 27, we get y is equal to 9 minus 27 to the 2/3 to the power 3/2. That's going to be 9 minus 3 cubed to the 2/3 to the power 3/2. Now that becomes 9 minus, the 3 will cancel here, and so you have 3 squared to the 3/2. But 3 squared is 9, so 9 minus 9 is 0, so the whole thing is 0. So we can sketch the graph like this. From 1 to 27. At 1, the value of y is 22.6, so let's say that's 22.6. At 27, the value of y is 0. And if you look at the derivative later on, we will see that it's concave upwards. So the graph will look like this. Oops, that should be before 0, okay? So that's the graph. We want to find the length of this curve. So prerequisites for this problem, we need to know the arc length formula, which is the integral from a to b of 1 minus f prime of x squared dx. And then we must also know the power rule of getting the derivative, general power rule. We will also need chain rule, and we will also need rules of exponents. Okay. So let's get our derivative of y. So y prime is equal to, I'm going to use power rule here. So when I say power rule, the derivative of x to the n is equal to n times x to the n minus 1. So the 3/2 goes up front. 9 minus x to the 2/3. 3/2 minus 2/2 is 1/2. Okay. Times the derivative of the inside, which is now the application of chain rule. So what is chain rule? That's a derivative of a composition of two functions. So to get the derivative of this, we will get the derivative of f with respect to g times the derivative of g with respect to x. So that's chain rule right there. Okay. So this is the derivative of f with respect to g. Now we will simply get the derivative of g. So here we go. 3/2, 9 minus x to the 2/3. You know that 1/2 is actually square root, so we can use the square root here. The derivative of 9 is 0. The derivative of negative x to the 2/3 is negative 1 times 2/3. X to the 2/3 minus 3/2 is negative 1/3. Again, to get the derivative of this, I use the power rule. So rewriting our problem, we should get 3/2 times negative 2/3 times the square root of 9 minus x to the 2/3 times x to the negative 1/3. So simplifying this, we get negative 1. So I simply have 9 minus x to the 2/3 over x to the 1/3. Because I put the exponent, I put the factor in the denominator, the negative exponent becomes positive. That's one of the rules of exponents. So that is our y prime. Now we will need to square that. So that's going to be the square of 9 minus x to the 2/3 over x to the 1/3, the whole thing squared. So negative times negative is positive. The square root will go away. 9 minus x to the 2/3. And x to the 1/3 times x to the 1/3 is x to the 2/3. which we can simplify as 9x to the negative 2/3 minus 1. How did that happen? Well, I simply distributed the denominator so 9 over x to the negative 2/3 becomes 9x to the negative 2/3, and this quantity divided by itself is equal to 1. So now we can rewrite our formula. So the arc length is from 1 to 27 of the square root of 1 plus the derivative squared is 9x to the negative 2/3 minus 1 dx. What do you notice about the 1 and the negative 1? They will cancel. And so we get simply 9 over x to the 2/3 dx, which we can rewrite as, using rules of algebra, square root of 9 over the square root of x to the 2/3 dx, which simplifies to, here we go, the square root of 9 is 3, the square root of x to the 2/3 is x to the 1/3. And so our integral reduces to 3 times x to the negative 1/3 dx, which we can rewrite as 3 times the integral of x to the negative 1/3 dx. Using now the power rule, we get 3 times x to the negative 1/3 plus 1, negative 1/3 plus 1, evaluated from 1 through 27. And so we get 3 times x to the 2/3 over 2/3 from 1 through 27, which becomes 3 times 3/2 x to the 2/3 1 through 27. Simplifying further, we get 9/2. That's 27 to the 2/3 minus 1 to the 2/3. We get, oh, I'm sorry, that should be 2 right there. So 9/2. It's going to be, now we can rewrite 27 as 3 cubed to the 2/3. 1 raised to any power will always be 1. So this simplifies to 9/2. The 3 will cancel, giving us 9. 9 minus 1 is 8. 8 times 9 is 72 over 2, or 36.